Welcome to the Week 15 wide receiver and cornerback matchup grades. I'm Jason Gilbo. As always, taking a look at the wide receiver and cornerback matchups for the main slate. A pretty good week. Obviously, we have the two Saturday games. Sunday night is now taken off of FanDuel. We have Monday night. As always, if you're looking for guys in those games, just let me know. I can get back to you. But looking at Sunday main slate here, a lot of guys that are kind of going to maybe fly under the radar or be in this mid-range that might get overlooked this week that are in pretty decent spots. Chris Hogan could potentially see Cody Sansabah this week. Obviously a fair matchup for Chris Hogan. Sansabah, who has filled in here time and time again, kind of he was with the Titans last year or previous years, was a guy that we didn't mind targeting then, certainly don't mind targeting now. He's only covered 117 routes this year, has allowed a high 0.6 fantasy points per route run. Chris Hogan was involved last week, played a ton of snaps last week, just wasn't as involved in the offense. That offense didn't really look fluent anyway. In this mid-range, obviously a much better play over on DK than the 7,100 on FanDuel, but going to be worth a look here. D.D. Westbrook, Kevin Johnson. This is a match that I'm very much looking to exploit. Allen Hurns still not practicing. Marquise Lee also in a good spot as well, but Westbrook obviously at these price tags is very intriguing, especially at the 5,700 on FanDuel. There was a tweet, and I name escapes me right now, but looking at guys that run, below a 4.4, 40, have torched Houston this year, and Westbrook fits that category. So that is something to note. Robert Woods due back this week, and to see Byron Maxwell, who came over to Seattle to fill in here for their basically banged up secondary. Maxwell allowing 0.48 fantasy points per run, 74% catch rate. I know people are afraid of obviously Seattle on the road. Seattle at home. I'm not really afraid of shying away from some of these guys like Robert Woods, Sammy Watkins, Cooper Kupp in these spots, but Woods obviously is in the best spot out of them all. I think he's worthy of a look in tournaments this week. As far as other options go, Corey Davis, Rashard Matthews, obviously facing a San Francisco secondary that we don't mind targeting. They're going to be obviously just GBP dart throws because this Tennessee passing offense just hasn't really been great this year. With that being said, I don't mind, going with them in GPPs as wide receiver threes because they're both cheap, but it's obviously not at that thrilling of a spot given the fact that the upside really hasn't been there this year. But the points per dollar return could be somewhat decent, but I am willing to look that way. In that same game, Marquise Goodwin has obviously been an excellent guy, 18 targets over the last 2 weeks. You look at LaShawn Sims, 0.35 fantasy points per route run. Going to be looking at Goodwin a little bit more on FanDuel. 6,600 is a little bit different than 6K on DraftKings, so do keep that in mind. I do think he's in play on both sites. I think a lot of people, obviously, because there's not a ton of touchdown upside, that people will be off of him. But there is certainly still some buzz given the fact that San Francisco is looking a little bit decent with Jimmy G under center there. So, don't mind him. He's in a good spot. Should keep it rolling here. Devontae Adams, he's in the better spot of the Packers this week. Darrell Worley, 0.33 fantasy points per hour run. Adams obviously the highest of that category as well for the Packers. Packers get Aaron Rodgers back this week. We're obviously expecting a lot out of Aaron Rodgers coming back and missing so much time after a shoulder issue. And I'm going to lower my expectations for a lot of these guys. I think if you're coming and thinking that Rodgers is going to throw 300 yards and 3-4 touchdowns, it's certainly in his range of outcomes, but I think the floor is a lot lower than what people are kind of overlooking. So, don't mind Adams. We're going to talk about other guys. Cobb's in a decent spot. He's in the same spot that Thielen was able to torch last week. Devin Funchess, he's actually one of my favorite options this week. Green Bay, bottom 3 in DVOA against wide receiver ones. Demarius Randall is a guy that I just love to target. 0.32 fantasy points per run this year. Funchess is a guy I just find to be kind of in this mid-range that I'm going to be using quite a bit of. So don't be afraid to shy away with him. Alshon Jeffrey in a decent spot, might be overlooked given the fact that the QB change is kind of dampening the mood there in Philly. Ross Cockrell, 0.33 fantasy points per hour run this year. I think there is a potential for the fact that Eagles might look to run a little bit more, play strong defense, and kind of grind this game out. Or the fact that they could kind of turn Foles loose and try and get him ready because there's going to be a game here in the playoffs where they need to get Foles to go. So, We could see that as well. Antonio Brown, I don't need to talk much about this guy. Expected shadow coverage from Malcolm Butler, not terribly afraid of him this year. 0.32 fantasy points per out run. Brown's just been on an unreal level. It's really hard to go away from him continuously. But of course, he's at a higher price tag. I don't want to hear the New England takes away your best weapons. Brown should still go out and get his. Mid-range this week, some decent names here. I mean, Jordy Nelson, we don't really get the discount on him that he's been at for the last 4 to 5 weeks where he's just been awful. He's a guy that I'm not expecting a ton of. I mean, you can take shots in GPPs. Obviously, the chemistry with Rodgers is the narrative that people are playing this week. He's in a decent spot. James Bradbury, it's an okay matchup. 0.30 fantasy points per run, but just a 57% catch rate. Nelson's offense obviously fell off. PFF still grades him fairly high, still slightly in that average range. So it hasn't been that bad. Stephon Diggs, in a better spot this week. Drake Kirkpatrick, I don't mind, kind of targeting here in time again. 0.29 fantasy points per run. Diggs 0.45. Still up there with some of the better 2017 wideouts. Michael Thomas, going to be shadowed by Morris Claiborne this week in the Superdome. I actually like Thomas quite a bit here. Morris Claiborne's been respectable this year. Obviously just got burned up by Demaryius Thomas in his prior week, was talking about a sprained ankle that was hindering him. Obviously Thomas would have a significant advantage. Thomas's upside has kind of picked up over the recent few weeks. We just never kind of get Thomas at a really good price tag. That's kind of my thing with him. Obviously the Jets are going to be in a bad spot pretty much all game long. I expect the Saints to run the ball quite a bit, but Thomas is still worth a look for me here. Shouldn't see a ton of ownership either. Brandon Cooks, Joe Hayden coming back for Steelers this week could potentially change some of these matchups, so I'll kind of cover that as we get closer and get more clarification on Hayden's status. Artie Burns, 0.26 fantasy points per route run, but digging kind of into the Pittsburgh secondary, they have struggled a little bit against deep passes this year. Cooks obviously has that potential, so I think we can kind of look at him in GPPs once again. As Russell Clay kind of always says on the slate breakdown, we don't necessarily always get Cooks at the ownership that we want in GPPs, mainly just because he has that 100-yard, two touchdown potential in this offense. So, I mean, tough to always kind of make a case for him in GPPs at lower ownership, but obviously he has that upside that can help you win one. So, don't mind him this week. This game is a potential shootout. Josh Gordon, Corey Coleman, we saw Baltimore struggle against Pittsburgh. Obviously, different tier of offense here. But I think obviously still in GPPs, you can look their way with no Jimmy Smith. Brandon Carr, fairly average, so I'm not really shying away from Josh Gordon this week. I think he's obviously going to be a guy that Cleveland continues to look at. The poor matchups this week, Adam Thielen, I'm not as high on him as I was earlier in the year. I don't think he's a bad option still this week. I'm still going to get some exposure. William Jackson's been pretty good in light coverage this year. Just 0.13. That's the lowest fantasy points per run allowed this week. But Cincinnati has obviously been vulnerable on the defensive side over the last few weeks. The injuries have kind of collected up and it hasn't been great. So Thielen's still worth a look. Larry Fitzgerald can certainly beat Kendall Fuller this week, as I say here. Fuller's been decent. I mean, 0.23 fantasy points per out run allowed. 64% catch rate out of the slot is a nice number for Fuller, just because there usually are high kind of catch rate routes. And, Fuller isn't allowing a ton. So I'm not really as high on Fitz as I wanted to be coming into this week because I love Fitzgerald. But at these prices, I'm going to look some other directions. These guys are still in play. I'm going to get to kind of a tier below here that I'm more off of. I still think Thielen, Fitz, and Baldwin are still worthy of a look. Doug Baldwin's also one of those guys. Roby Coleman's been fantastic this year. 0.24 fantasy points per hour run. Baldwin is still hard to ignore, especially given the fact that the volume of this passing offense in Russell Wilson is still very high. It kind of negates the fact that some of these are in tough matchups. We saw it last week with Jacksonville, and of course, I mean, if you faded that game, it's obviously frustrating because of the 50-plus yard bombs that were coming in from Wilson towards the end of the game. And obviously those guys still hitting or surpassing value. Tough spot this week, but at home here in a crucial game, I still like the Seattle passing game quite a bit. AJ Green, price has come down a little bit. Xavier Rhodes going to expected to shadow him this week. I think the upside's pretty limited. Rhodes 0.26 fantasy points per out run allowed this year. Most of that was actually due to Marvin Jones. He was below 0.20 for most of this year heading into that game. AJ Green, I mean, you can make the case in GPPs if you're building multiple lineups. I don't hate the idea, but it's not a great spot. DeAndre Hopkins, he's the guy that I'm just off of this week. Going to see a Jacksonville game. He might get 60 yards and a touchdown. We've seen, him get a touchdown on Patrick Peterson. We saw him get a touchdown on Jacksonville earlier this year. I'm just not as high on him because the price tag, you need much more than that. Getting Bouye, getting Jalen Ramsey, these are not guys that I just really like targeting. I mean, there's a reason why Jacksonville is just allowing less than 15 fantasy points per game to wide receivers this year. I mean, those are just stellar numbers that I'm not going after. Robbie Anderson, tough for me to get excited about this week. Obviously, he's been great, but no Josh McCown here. That already downgrades him. New Orleans has some really good cornerbacks. Obviously, Marshawn Lattimore is a very quick, and I noticed this kind of the Brandon Cooks game, given Lattimore speed, really hung well with Cooks, and Anderson's a similar type of player where he's running a lot of downfield, a lot of vertical routes, and Lattimore can hang with him. So a little bit off of him here. DK, you might want to take a look if you can just hope for that he gets a huge bomb. 78 on FanDuel is too steep for me. Tre'Davious White has obviously been awesome out of LSU this year, just allowing 0.22 fantasy points per hour run. Kenny Stills, I don't know, maybe optimizers are spitting him up somewhere. Maybe people are looking at him, but not really looking his way. I'm more on, the running game here with Kenyon Drake. You can make a case for Jarvis Landry as well. He's in a slightly better spot out of the slot, so. That's it for me. You can head over to dailyfantasycafe.com. Check out this article in written form as it is here. It's up for premium members. Check out the rest of our NFL content here in the Cafe on Air, our podcast, more articles here. If you're looking for the dashboard, that's where our cheat sheets lie. Come check us out. We got the optimizer, everything going as well too. And that's it for me. Good luck in week 15.